typing away like crazy now. Here now.
Just go ahead. Welcome back to the call,
Al. Without even a need for administration, Franklin continues, the circulation is perpetually regulated according to need. There is no inflation or deflation because the circulation always arises and passes with the life and consumption of the production. So this is the vital principle of a currency and a circulation which is always immutable and in its original obligations and representation of property. This payment and retirement of principal out of circulation at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property is the only thing which solves inflation and deflation, as is vital to an immutable currency, which is vital to every just purpose of a purported economy, and which, of course, is impossible under the present system. So Franklin continues then, neither, therefore, do we suffer multiplication of debt by interest, of course, because the currency is not subject to interest. It's merely a promise, as a promissory obligation actually truly is in every case, to pay for something with an equal measure of production, which would be unexploited, true free enterprise. He says, neither therefore do we suffer multiplication of debt by interest. In fact, the very ability of the people to issue their promises to pay itself makes it possible to sustain whatever prosperity we are capable of. End of brief speech. My essay goes on then to explain some of this, saying, so far had his English cousins deviated from this natural pattern that the rectitude of a populace issuing a just currency was even an affront to them. Sound familiar? The very quests of his audience for unearned profit to deprive the general population not only of their production, but of the very opportunity to produce. And I was explaining to Al in the interim there that being as the pool of wealth is produced by production, and the principal object of true free enterprise is just reward for production. In nature, for instance, if you build a home, you are the owner of the home. Therefore, any exploitation or taking from the pool of wealth, which is not commensurable with equal contribution, deprives the real producers of just reward for their production. Furthermore, then, being as this is done through this perpetual multiplication of what I've called artificial indebtedness by interest, as this multiplication of artificial indebtedness dedicates ever more of a circulation to servicing this artificial sum of debt, or dispossesses us, we who produce, to a handful of bankers who produce nothing, this too deprives us of the very opportunity to produce, because of a further thing, which is that dedication of the circulation to servicing debt versus sustaining industry diminishes the amount of industry that we can sustain and the very jobs by which we can partake or participate in production and partake of just reward for production. So the fact that this is terminal has tremendous, this process, this unjustifiable process is terminal, has tremendous implications. In fact, this system that we call capitalism, or a central banking system, is in fact mutually exclusive to true, free, and just enterprise. So, as I say, the very quests of his audience for unearned profit to deprive the general population not only of their production, but of the very opportunity to produce. In fact, this very audience enjoyed undeserved advantages which they presumed would disappear if the people were allowed to prosper in rectitude. So they become supporters of exploitation in any system of exploitation, or what we call loosely modern capitalism, which is a mathematical fact, is mutually exclusive to true free enterprise and monetary justice, or just reward for production. The transparent facts of their existence could prove no match for the arguments of demonstrable solution. They even intended to remain a cause of the very problems the colonist solution addressed. Lacking any basis whatever for refutation, and wanting yet to denounce Franklin, they were at first relieved when finally the same angry man shouted again, above the murmuring everywhere. "That's preposterous," he yelled. "How could you levy taxes or fund government with this mere scrip?" Laughter and sarcasm erupted among the audience. Franklin was now openly ridiculed. He waited again to explain, finally saying, "That's quite simple as well." He stood letting the next while pass so they could ruminate their repeated mistake of presuming he might not answer capably. Suppose we have a township on one side of a river, which is unnavigable and unfordable, and an opposing township on the other. One of these townships might build a lumber mill. The other builds a grist mill. Foreseeing the eventual need to support activity above initial demands, each builds their mill to greater capacities than first required. As each township needs the services of the other township's mills, eventually it is proposed to build a bridge across the river. A group of men then agree to build the bridge to agreed standards, and when we agree on a fee to pay them for this service, likewise, we simply create the necessary notes and pay them. As the increased commerce requires the increased circulation to sustain it, there is no inflation, and therefore we have provided in all ways to sustain the desired commerce. To fund the proper services of government, such as the creation of this bridge, we have no need to levy taxes or to subject our people to eternal multiplication of debt. We have provided the real service of government without cost. Blood would be shed for his excellent explanation. Franklin's heckler was an officer of the Bank of England, seated with several officers of Parliament. Common sense tells the rest of the story. The very following day, the Bank of England's Parliament passed a resolution outlawing colonial scrip as currency. In a mere guise of propriety, the future Americans were required to turn in their vital scrip for bonds issued by the Bank of England. Although they were to be paid some menial interest for the bonds, however, the bonds, too, were outlawed as circulation. Lawful trade, therefore, was impossible. To no surprise, then, the same provision allowed the colonists to turn in the bonds for notes issued by the Bank of England. These notes alone could they use as currency, and to their further disadvantage, they were required to pay some 30% annual interest for the usurped circulation. 30% annual interest. Thus, for explaining the wisdom of true economy, Franklin was forced to take the news of perpetual multiplication of debt back to his people. As we know today, the colonists rejected this crime against them and prevailed in the ensuing military conflict. The House of Rothschild, under the guise of a Bank of England, would pay for Hessian mercenaries to subdue the colonists. Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware would thus defeat Hessians encamped at Trenton, hired to enforce a plutocracy. Yet even the real nature of the conflict would disappear from our own history. These crimes against the colonists would fail at great cost of life. But the banks which had been established here would succeed. With interest perpetually multiplying debt upon the new land, political subversion would readily be purchased with illimitable unearned profit. Attempts to eternalize usury would fail under the illuminated leaders of the young nation, but would finally succeed in 1913 under corruption and ineptitude, which prevails to this day. And in the style of all banks which are named what they are not, the eventual private central bank of America would be called the Federal Reserve, even as it is neither federal nor a reserve of anything. But these are later chapters of our history, and we are only at its beginning. The governments of Europe, of course, were threatened by the infectious ideas and courage of the Revolution. Few Europeans, therefore, dared openly support the colonial efforts. Mere contact put lives in danger. Friendships, however deep, were at least temporarily cut off. In restoring one such relationship after the war, Franklin explained the real cause of the American Revolution in a conciliatory letter to a friend in France. Quote, "We would have gladly borne the little tax on tea and other matters, had it not been that they took from us our money, which created great unemployment and dissatisfaction. Within a year the poorhouses were filled. The hungry and homeless walked the streets everywhere." So I used to tell this story off the top of my head, and when I was finished, I would let the audience ruminate on it for a brief while, and then I would ask, "So what is wrong with this story?" And then I would explain to everyone's incredulity, disbelief, that the fault of the second example, where he funds government without taxation by spending money into circulation, is inherently inflationary, and that every unit of the currency requires a obligation to pay and retire principal, at least at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, or we absolutely cannot solve our monetary issues. But moreover, that it's right that we do so because everything is consumed and it's rightfully paid for according to consumption by whoever consumes of it. So in truth then, this too proves that there is this fact that every unit of the circulation has to have attached to it an obligation to pay that unit out of circulation corresponding to consumption of the represented value. This itself prescribes a fact that a promissory obligation and a promissory obligation only are the only way to monetize all wealth. Now, how can we quickly understand that any other alternative is, let's say, imposes faults upon the respective monetary system? Well, in the case of a precious metal monetary standard, gold or silver standard as we familiarly know it, you can only issue so much circulation as gold and silver. Well, we might agree on a relative value of gold and silver at some time, but industry potentially expanding practically infinitely beyond that means that the original circulation, as it becomes subject to commitments, imposes injustices and inabilities to sustain the further industry, because that circulation was appropriate for the original volume of industry only. So in effect then, a gold standard eventually precipitates in breach of the gold standard for the historic fact that such a finite circulation cannot sustain